In the spring of 2014 in Burke County, North Carolina, a woman named Ora Calhoun sat in the third row of a folding chair meeting at the county extension office and listened to a credentialed food safety specialist explain, with practiced patience, that her grandmother's Crocks were a liability. The specialist, whose name was Dr. Vance, had driven down from the state university with a slide deck and a box of approved food-grade containers, and she told the assembled home fermenters, in the calm, level tone of someone stating the obvious, that salt-glazed stoneware was a relic, that its porosity and its glaze chemistry were inconsistent at best and dangerous at worst, and that anyone serious about lacto-fermentation in the modern era needed to move on. She held up a clear polypropylene crock with a water seal lid and said it was the future of safe, scalable fermentation. Ora said nothing. She drove her 1998 pickup home to the 40-acre parcel she had worked since 1984, fed Plum, her old blue-tick hound, and went down into the root cellar to check her brine levels. 9 years later, in the autumn of 2023, a fermentation buyer from Asheville named Reed drove up that same hollow in a newer truck than Ora's, walked into the root cellar, and stood in front of 22 crocks of varying age and asked a single question before he made an offer. The lot, appraised at the estate sale of Ora's neighbor that spring at $400 and passed among local buyers, like a curiosity nobody knew what to do with, was sitting in a Reed's truck bed by sunset. He paid $1,200, triple the estate price. He paid it without negotiating, which is the kind of thing that makes people talk, and it made Ora's granddaughter Bess talk most of all, because Bess had stood in the same root cellar 2 summers earlier with a food studies degree from Chapel Hill, and repeated nearly word for word what Dr. Vance had said in 2014. And by 2023, Bess was the one copying Ora's ledger by hand, because she understood at last what the crocks were carrying, that no slide deck had ever measured. Let me tell you about what a salt-glazed stoneware crock actually does to a brine, because this story does not make sense without it, and it is not a story about sentiment. Stoneware fired at high temperatures, roughly 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit, in a traditional wood or salt kiln, produces a clay body that is vitrified, meaning the silica in the clay is fused into a glass-like matrix. When sodium chloride is introduced into the kiln at peak temperature, it volatilizes into sodium vapor, which bonds with the silica at the vessel's surface to form a glaze composed of sodium silicate. The result is a skin that is hard, slightly pocked like an orange peel, and chemically active in the presence of a saline solution. That last part is what Dr. Vance's slide deck did not address because it had not been studied at the scale she cared about. What Ora's grandmother Delia had observed and written down in a pocket ledger she kept near the crock shelf was that brine fermented in salt-glazed stoneware behaved differently from brine in glass or in tin. It soured more evenly. It threw less surface film. It recovered faster after a draw of cold air. Delia had noted these things in the 1940s without a vocabulary for the underlying chemistry. She described it as the crock knowing the culture. What she was observing, though she could not have named it, was a mild ion exchange between the sodium silicate glaze and the brine, which contributed a small, steady influx of dissolved silicates and moderated pH fluctuation in the early fermentation window, the precise window when a young brine is most vulnerable to contamination by competing organisms. That vulnerability window matters, so let me be precise about it. When you pack fresh cabbage into a brine and weight it down, The lactofermentation process begins as lactobacillus bacteria, naturally present on the cabbage leaf, begin converting sugars to lactic acid. In the first 24 to 72 hours before the pH drops far enough to suppress competing organisms, the brine is open to colonization by anything present in the environment. A glass vessel is chemically inert. Polypropylene is chemically inert. They contribute nothing to the brine environment during that window, which means the brine is on its own to establish the acidic conditions that protect it. A salt-glazed crock in continuous use is not inert. Its interior wall carries, in that transition zone between glaze and clay body, populations of dormant lactobacillus cells from previous fermentations, and those cells can reactivate within hours of brine contact and seed the early environment. You are not starting from scratch. You are waking something up. The effect is measurable in the pH curve of the first 3 days, which drops faster and more steeply in a well-maintained stoneware crock than in a new glass or plastic vessel receiving a first batch. Delia did not have a pH meter. She had a taste and a dated note and 40 years of accumulated comparison. She knew the difference. She wrote it down. The pocket ledger was not a recipe book. It was a field record. Ora knew this because she had read the ledger and because she had fermented in her grandmother's crocks for 40 years and watched it happen. She did not have a publication to point to. She had cabbage. Her kraut averaged 18 months of aging in those crocks before she sold it. Modern commercial lacto-fermented kraut, the kind packed in polypropylene vessels at a food-safe facility with a certified HACCP plan, averages 6 to 8 weeks. The difference in flavor is not subtle and is not a matter of preference. Aged kraut fermented in a continuously maintained culture environment develops a depth of acidity that young brine product cannot replicate. Because the microbial community inside the crock changes across months, with successive waves of lactobacillus species dominating in sequence and each wave conditioning the brine for the next. A crock that has been in continuous use for decades carries, in its porous walls and in the starter culture maintained inside it, a community of organisms adapted specifically to that vessel, that cellar temperature, that water mineral profile, that cabbage variety. You cannot start that culture from scratch. It accumulates. It is, in the truest sense, a place-specific resource, and its value is invisible to any assessment that measures only what can be standardized and replicated. Ora was known for 2 things in the county. She was known for never raising her voice, and she was known for keeping crocks that her mother's neighbors had been fermenting in since before the Second World War. She had not sought the extension meeting in 2014. She had attended because her neighbor Wayne had asked her to come with him, and because she thought it might be useful for the younger fermenters in the room to hear the conversation that would follow. Wayne was a good man, a sincere farmer who trusted people with degrees because they had usually done more formal studying than he had. He ran 60 acres of raised bed vegetables and had been doing small-batch lacto-fermentation for 8 years. After Dr. Vance's presentation, he bought 4 of the polypropylene crocks with the water seal lids. He was not wrong to trust the credentials. He was simply operating on a time horizon that the credentials could not see. Dr. Vance had introduced herself that evening with her doctorate from NC State, her extension appointment, and her 15 years in food safety research. The narrator must say clearly that she was not wrong about porosity. Salt-glazed stoneware does have a surface texture that differs from glass. The pocks of a salt glaze under magnification are uneven. A poorly maintained crock, improperly cleaned or left with residual organic matter in a crack, can harbor pathogens. And this has happened, and people have been made sick. Dr. Vance was a careful person who cared about public health, and her warning was grounded in documented cases. What she could not account for, because it was not in the literature she had been given, was that a properly maintained, continuously cultured stoneware vessel in a cool, stable cellar with a clean brine community had a contaminations profile that was not worse than the alternatives. It was, in some measurable respects, better. She had the cases. She did not have Ora's cellar. She held up the polypropylene crock and said, in a voice that carried the benign confidence of someone correcting a grandfather's driving habits, that stoneware was a folk habit nobody had ever tested rigorously, that people assumed it worked because they could not see what it was doing inside the brine, and that assumption was precisely the kind of thing modern food science existed to replace. Ora sat in the third row and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that 40 years of data in a pocket ledger would not say better. Wayne went home with his polypropylene crocks. Ora went home with Plum at her heel and a jar of 9-month kraut she had brought as a hostess gift for the woman running the extension office, who tucked it under her desk and ate it on her lunch break for 3 weeks. Wayne was not, by any reasonable measure, doing poorly. He was doing exactly what the extension system had designed its guidance to support, and for several years the evidence agreed with that design. He bought 4 polypropylene crocks in 2014 and 4 more in 2015, then upgraded to a 10-gallon commercial-grade vessel in 2016 when the regional grocery distributor expressed interest in scaling his pickle program. He poured $3,800 into a used stainless brine mixing table and a commercial slicer that year, and he installed a chest freezer in the production outbuilding to hold finished product ahead of delivery. His county food establishment permit cost $240 annually and required an inspection that Wayne prepared for by keeping the facility in better order than he kept his own house. He took notes from the extension guidance, bought a calibrated pH meter, and logged his readings in a 3-ring binder because the distributor's supplier quality form required documented process controls. By 2016, Wayne was shipping 32 cases of fresh pack pickled green beans per month to a distribution hub in Hickory at a price per jar that left him, after costs, a margin of about 42 cents. It was not a rich margin, but it was consistent, and Wayne was a patient man who understood that consistency was its own kind of value. Ora sold 48 jars of aged kraut and fermented vegetables at market that same year, at prices ranging from $9 to $18 per jar, depending on age and product. She did not fill orders she could not meet. She turned down 2 restaurant accounts in Asheville that year because she did not have the volume, and she did not change the maintenance protocol to increase volume, because changing the protocol would have meant changing the result, and the result was what the restaurants were paying for. She did not think about Wayne's 42 cents per jar as a contrast to anything. She thought about the temperature log and whether the cellar door was staying sealed through the fall nights. The numbers were what they were. Wayne's operation looked from the road like a real business, and Ora's looked like a hobby. The summer of 2014 was the summer Bess came home from her first year at Chapel Hill. She was 22, and she had taken a food systems seminar that had assigned the same literature Dr. Vance drew from, and she was politely convinced that her grandmother was running, as she put it, an unsanctioned fermentation operation out of a root cellar that had not been inspected since the Reagan administration. She said this at the kitchen table in July, sitting across from Ora with the particular confidence of someone whose certainty is borrowed from a reading list. Ora set a bowl of week-old brine-fermented green beans in front of her and asked what she thought. Bess said they were very good. Ora said she knew. If you have ever eaten a properly aged, lacto-fermented vegetable from a live culture crock that has been running for decades, you know there is no way to explain that flavor from the outside. It does not taste like vinegar. It does not taste like brine. It tastes like something that has been arriving at itself for a very long time, which is exactly what it is. The microbial community in Ora's oldest crock, a 3-gallon salt glaze piece her grandmother Delia had carried from Wilkes County in 1938, had been in continuous operation for nearly 60 years by that summer. 60 years of draws and refreshes, 60 years of seasonal temperature variation in that particular cellar, 60 years of adaptation to the mineral profile of the well water on that 40-acre parcel. You do not rebuild that from a packet of starter culture. You inherit it, and you keep it alive, and you understand what you are holding. Bess went back to Chapel Hill in August. She was not yet ready to understand what she was holding. She was ready, though, to ask a specific question. She called Ora in October of that year from her dorm room and asked about the fermentation process in Delia's crocks in a way that was different from the polite skepticism of July. She was taking a food microbiology module, and something in the reading had snagged her attention. She asked what happens to the culture in the crock when you draw from it and refresh it. She was asking about continuity. She had started to wonder whether what was in the crock was a culture in the way a sourdough starter is a culture, a living community maintained across time rather than a static method. Ora said yes. She said that was exactly what it was. Bess said she had not understood that before. She had understood fermentation as a process applied to vegetables. She had not understood that the crock was itself part of the process, and that the community living in it was something that accumulated, adapted, and could not be reconstructed from a neutral starting point. Ora said that is what the ledger is for, so you know what it has been through. Bess did not come home for Thanksgiving that year, and Ora did not take it as a slight. Bess came home for Christmas and asked to see the ledger, and Ora showed her the first 40 pages, the ones in Delia's handwriting, which were dense and practical and occasionally funny in the dry way of someone writing for their own memory rather than for an audience. Bess read for 2 hours. She did not say much. She went back to Chapel Hill in January and took the food microbiology module exam and scored well, and in a short answer response about traditional fermentation methods, she wrote 2 sentences about the role of vessel chemistry in shaping microbial community composition, which her professor marked with a question mark and the words, "interesting point," not well established in the literature. Do you have a source? Bess had written that her source was her grandmother's crock, maintained in Burke County since 1938. She did not turn that version in. She was not yet at a place where she could argue it. That would take longer. Wayne, meanwhile, was building toward the peak of his confidence. His polypropylene crocks were clean and certifiable, and he had taken on a contract supplying a regional grocery distributor with fresh-packed pickled green beans, which did not require aging and moved fast. By 2016, he had invested $14,000 in food-grade plastic vessels and a commercial brine mixing station, and his operation looked, by every visible measure, like a success. He had a county food establishment permit framed on the wall of the small outbuilding he called a production facility. Ora helped him haul the polypropylene bins one Saturday, and they ate lunch on his tailgate, and he was genuinely happy. She was glad for him. Wayne's path made sense on his terms, and she did not begrudge him any part of it. She had her own path, which had not changed. She drew from the crocks in winter, refreshed them in spring with fresh harvested cabbage, and late summer with green beans and October with turnips, kept the cellar between 54 and 58 degrees year-round by managing the door and the ventilation shafts her grandfather had built into the hillside, and sold her aged product at 2 farmers' markets and to 3 restaurants in Asheville, whose chefs had found her, one by one, through word of mouth that never made it onto a website. She charged more than Wayne charged. She charged more than anyone charged. The chefs paid it without argument because there was nothing else like it in the region, and they knew it. In the spring of 2019, one of those chefs, a man named Patel who ran a fermentation-focused kitchen on Lexington Avenue in Asheville, brought a food writer from a regional magazine to Ora's cellar. The writer stood at the rack of crocks in the cool dark and said very little. He asked one question, which was how old the oldest culture running in here was. Ora said the 3-gallon piece in the corner had been running since her grandmother's hands last touched it, and if you counted from Delia's first refresh on that crock in Wilkes County, it was somewhere past 70 years. The writer wrote a piece that ran in April of that year. Dr. Vance read it. She made a note to herself that she did not, at that time, act on. Which brings us to Wayne, because by 2020, Wayne's production facility was facing a different kind of pressure. The summer of 2021 was the beginning of the end of Wayne's comfort. A regional wholesale consolidator that had been buying a large portion of the fresh-pack fermented vegetable supply in the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast began sourcing from a larger facility in Virginia that could undercut Wayne's price by 30%. Wayne had the food establishment permit and the $14,000 in equipment and the contract expired in January of 2022 and was not renewed. That was a manageable setback. He had dealt with market shifts before. What happened next was not manageable. In late spring of 2022, a contamination event traced to a polypropylene vessel, manufacturer's plasticizer chemistry, made national food safety news. The mechanism was specific and documented. Certain food-grade polypropylene crocks, when exposed to brine at temperatures above 68 degrees Fahrenheit for extended periods, leached a family of plastic-derived compounds into the fermentation environment at levels that exceeded the EPA's informal guidance thresholds for those compounds. The compounds in question were not the obvious plasticizers that regulatory frameworks had long targeted. They were secondary additives, slip agents, and nucleating compounds used in the molding process that had not been evaluated in long brine contact scenarios because the certification system had not been designed to evaluate them in that context. The vessels were not defective. The standard was incomplete. The distinction mattered in a legal sense and did not matter at all to Wayne's operation. This was not a crisis that arrived dramatically. It arrived as a news story in May, then as a trade publication notice in June, then as a phone call from Wayne's distributor in July, who said he needed to pause incoming orders until the vessel question was resolved at the supplier level. Wayne knew the vessels were being questioned. He had read the news story. He had not known, until the phone call, that the pause would extend to his operations specifically, or that the timeline for resolution would be measured in seasons rather than weeks. The FDA issued an advisory in August. The State Extension Office issued its own guidance in September, which effectively suspended commercial lacto-fermentation permits for any operation using polypropylene vessels as primary aging containers until the vessels could be tested and cleared on a lot-by-lot basis. That process took 11 months. In those 11 months, Wayne's production stopped entirely. The cost of lot testing ran to $7,000, which Wayne paid by drawing on a home equity line he had not touched since taking out the note on the additional acreage in 2017. He cleared the certification in August of 2023. By then, his buyer relationships had reorganized around other suppliers, and rebuilding them would take time and price concessions Wayne could not afford. He held 73 acres with a note that had not paused for the FDA timeline. At no point during those 11 months did Aura's root cellar stop working. The culture was the same culture it had been in 2014. The crocks were the same crocks. The temperature log continued twice a day in the same format Delia had established. 45 jars of aged product went to the Asheville restaurants in the fall of 2022, at the same price as Aura had charged the year before. Chef Patel served it and said nothing different from what he always said, which was nothing, because the product spoke without assistance. Dr. Vance sent an email to the fermenters on her extension list in October of 2022 with updated guidance. The subject line said simply, Revised Vessel Guidance. It acknowledged that the 2014 recommendation for polypropylene as a universal replacement for stoneware had not adequately accounted for long-aging applications. It recommended stoneware, glass, or food-grade ceramic for any brine held at aging temperature for longer than 90 days. It did not mention Aura by name. It did not need to. Aura read the email at the kitchen table with Plum asleep at her feet, and she did not say anything, because there was nothing to say. It was Bess who said it later that evening on the phone from Durham, where she was finishing a graduate certificate in food systems. She had read the email, too, because she was on her grandmother's list. She said quietly that she had been thinking about the Crocks. She said she had been thinking about what Aura had said in the kitchen in 2014, which was that some things work because they know the place, and no certification can teach a vessel what a place knows. Bess had not understood it then. She said she thought she understood it now. Aura told her to come home for Thanksgiving, and she would show her the ledger. What Bess found in that ledger when she came home was not sentiment. It was 40 pages of Delia's handwriting, followed by 30 years of Aura's, and together they constituted a longitudinal fermentation record that no university food science program had ever produced, because no university had ever funded a study of a single continuously running culture maintained in the same vessel at the same site for 60-plus years. Temperature readings taken twice daily, dating to 1952, draw and refresh cycles, flavor notes keyed to cabbage variety and harvest timing, anomaly observations recorded across decades. Summer of 1966, when surface film developed earlier than usual, traced by Delia to a warm August that pushed cellar temperatures past 62 degrees, and the adjustments she made. The winter of 1979, when the cellar door seal failed, and a cold snap killed the surface culture in 2 of the 5 crocks running at the time, and Aura's account of the recovery protocol, which required 6 weeks of patient reintroduction. Not one of these events was unusual in isolation. Together, across that many pages, they constituted an adaptive management record of a biological system that was, by any honest accounting, irreplaceable. Bess sat at that kitchen table until midnight, and then she asked to borrow the ledger to make a copy. Aura said she could have a copy, but the ledger stayed in the house. The spring of 2023 was when the estate sale happened. Wayne had made the hard decision in February, selling the 73 acres at a price that covered the note and left him with something, though not enough to start over at scale. His household contents and farm goods went to a sale company out of Valdez, which ran a Saturday auction at the property in March. Among the goods was the stoneware he had accumulated over the years, pieces he had bought at various sales, thinking he might use them someday when the stoneware guidance came back into favor, and a few pieces that had belonged to his mother, who had fermented in crocks her whole life and passed them to Wayne without a word of instruction, because in her generation you did not explain what everyone already knew. The estate auctioneer packaged the stoneware into a lot with some miscellaneous pottery and kitchen goods and priced it at $400. At a Saturday estate sale in Burke County, $400 for a mixed lot of old crocks, some cracked, some stained, 2 with hairline fractures, 1 with a chip on the rim, was not an unreasonable price if you were buying them as decorative pieces. It was a serious misread if you knew what you were looking at. Reed knew what he was looking at. Reed Baca was 28 years old, the son of a commercial kimchi producer in Buncombe County, and he had been fermenting since he could reach the crock shelf in his father's production room. He had an eye for salt glaze because he had spent enough time looking at good stoneware to recognize the signature of a wood salt firing in the color variation of the exterior, the particular orange peel surface of a high-fire sodium vapor glaze, and the interior color tone that came from decades of brine contact. He had driven to the Wayne estate sale on a Saturday morning to look at the lot specifically, because a friend who had attended a preview had mentioned, casually, that there was some old stoneware, and that one piece looked like it might be a Jugtown piece from the 30s or 40s. Reed paid $1,200 for the lot without negotiating, loaded it into his truck, and stopped at Ora's place on his way back to Asheville, because Ora was, in the community of working fermenters in that part of the mountains, the person you stopped to see when you had a question. He carried the 3-gallon crock from the truck bed to Ora's kitchen table and set it down, and he asked her what she thought. Ora turned it over in her hands. She looked at the interior glaze for a long time. She set it right side up and looked at the exterior, then held it at an angle to the window light to read the texture of the salt fire surface. She set it down. She said it was probably a Burns crock from the pottery in Mayodan. She said the interior color told her it had held brine for a very long time, and that if the original culture was alive in the wall, it would need 6 months to reactivate from a starter. Reed said he thought the original culture was gone. Ora said she was not sure about that. This is what she meant. A salt-glazed stoneware crock that has held a live brine culture over many years does not simply become sterile when it is emptied and dried. The porous body of the fired clay, particularly the transition zone between the glazed interior surface and the unglazed clay wall, retains dormant lactobacillus cells in a state of metabolic suspension that can persist for years in cool, dry conditions. This is not a universally accepted fact in food science literature, because it has not been studied adequately. It is, however, what Delia wrote in 1961, after she recovered a culture from a crock that had been dry in the cellar for 3 years following a cracked lid that had rendered it unusable. She had filled it with fresh brine and left it for 2 weeks. What came back was not a generic lactofermentation. It was what had been there before. Reed asked Ora if she had anything in a continuous culture that she could trace back to a known starting point. She told him about the 3-gallon piece in the root cellar and the ledger and the 60-plus years. Reed asked if he could bring someone to see it. The someone Reed brought was a researcher named Grady from the microbiology department at Western Carolina University, who had been documenting microbial biodiversity in traditionally fermented Appalachian foods for 3 years and who had, until that autumn, not been able to locate a live culture crock with a documented continuous record longer than 20 years. Grady came in October of 2023 on a Tuesday with sampling equipment and a recording device, and she spent 4 hours in Aura's root cellar. The question Grady asked before she opened her kit was quiet and precise. She asked whether Aura knew what strains were in here. Aura said she knew what the brine produced and how to keep it producing. She said she did not have a name for what was in there in the way Grady meant. Grady said that was all right. She said the names were what she was here to find. What Grady found, in the subsequent lab analysis, was a culture community in the 3-gallon Burns crock that included at least 4 lactobacillus strains that did not match any entry in the regional culture databases she worked from. 2 were consistent with known species adapted to low-temperature, long-aging environments. 2 were distinct enough in their sequence profiles that Grady labeled them provisional isolates and sent the samples to a collaborator at a university in Vermont who specialized in Appalachian fermentation ecology. The collaborator's response, which arrived in December, used the word unique twice and asked if she could visit in the spring. Whether the strains were genuinely novel in a taxonomic sense, or regional variants of known species carrying functional adaptations, was a question that would require further sequencing, and the full answer was still pending. What was not pending was their performance in a brine environment. In a controlled fermentation trial run at Western Carolina over the following winter, Grady used fresh brine in glass vessels, inoculated with a draw from Aura's crock, to ferment cabbage from 3 different Appalachian varieties. The culture performed consistently across all 3. The pH curves in the first 72 hours were steeper than Grady had recorded in any of her prior trials with commercial starter cultures. The microbial community stabilized faster. The surface film formation rate across 12 weeks of aging was lower than in any control vessel. The sensory evaluation, conducted blind with 12 panelists drawn from the Western Carolina Food Science faculty, and a panel of working chefs recruited through a Asheville culinary network, compared Aura's 3-year kraut against 12 commercial and artisan fermented cabbage samples, including 2 nationally distributed products and 4 regional artisan brands with strong reputations. Aura's product was not identified as Aura's, it was simply Sample 11. Sample 11 scored first on flavor complexity, first on depth and integration of acidity, and first on finish. 3 panelists asked after the reveal whether Sample 11 was a different product category because it did not taste like a normal kraut. One of the chef panelists said it tasted like something that had been thinking for a long time. Grady submitted a paper in the spring of 2024. The abstract, named Aura's 40-acre parcel in Burke County, cited the ledger with its 70-plus years of unbroken record as the most complete longitudinal documentation of a maintained Appalachian lacto-fermentation culture currently known, and noted that the culture's performance characteristics, particularly in the early phase pH curve, suggested an adaptation profile consistent with decades of site-specific selection pressure. It was careful language. It did not say the crock knew the brine. It said the evidence was consistent with that possibility. The licensing offer came in July. A regional artisan food company based in Asheville wanted to license the culture for use in their fermentation program, with annual draws from Aura's crocks under a maintenance protocol Aura would control and approve. They were explicit that the protocol was Aura's intellectual property and that no draw would be made without her present. The number in the letter was $18,000 per year, with a first-year advance of $18,000 on signing. $18,000. Ora read it twice. She set the letter on the kitchen table and sat with it for a while. Plum was at her feet, asleep in the way old dogs sleep when they have found a warm patch and decided that is enough for the afternoon. The ledger was on the shelf above the door where it had lived in both Delia's time and hers since before Ora was born. It had never been anywhere else. The number sat in the room for a long time before Ora picked up the phone. She called Bess first. Bess said, after a pause that had weight in it, that she owed Ora an apology. Ora said she did not need one. Bess said she wanted to give one anyway, and that she also wanted to know if Ora would teach her the maintenance protocol, the full one, the one in the ledger, so that when the time came, she would know what to do. Ora said, "Come home and I will show you." Dr. Vance received a copy of Grady's paper in a departmental email in June of 2024. She read it carefully. She was, by that time, 3 years past the revised vessel guidance she had sent in 2022, and she had been following the literature on stoneware fermentation with a different kind of attention than she had brought to it in 2014. She contacted Grady, and through Grady she asked if she might visit Ora's cellar for her own research purposes. Ora said yes. Dr. Vance came in August, on a Saturday. She stood in the cellar for a long time with her hands in her pockets. She did not bring a slide deck. At the kitchen table afterward, she said plainly that she had given the 2014 guidance in good faith and that it had not served fermenters in the long-aging category well. She said she thought the extension system owed a rethinking of how it evaluated traditional methods that predated the regulatory frameworks designed to evaluate them. Ora poured her a cup of coffee. Doctor, Vance asked if she would be willing to serve on an advisory panel the Extension Office was assembling to revisit fermentation guidance. Ora said she would think about it. What Ora thought about that evening was Wayne. She drove over to his new place, a modest house on 12 acres he had bought after the estate sale settled, and she brought a jar of 3-year Crock, and they sat on his porch in the cooling August air, and she told him about the licensing offer and about Grady's paper and about Dr. Vance's visit. Wayne said he was glad for her. He meant it, because Wayne was a good man, and Ora knew it. She told him she wanted him to have 2 of the stoneware Crocks from her cellar, with a draw from the culture and the maintenance protocol written out by hand, and that if he wanted to try long aging again, she would walk him through the first season. Wayne said she didn't need to do that. She said she knew she didn't need to. By the end of 2024, Bess had moved back to the Hollow and was learning the cellar in the way you learn something you understand will take years. She carried a notebook. She took the cellar temperature twice a day, which is what Delia had done, and she wrote down what she observed. She asked questions when she had them, and was quiet when she did not. In November, she made her first independent draw from the 3-gallon Burns Crock and refreshed it alone, without Ora standing beside her, and the brine came back the way it was supposed to come back. Reed stopped by that December with a case of the kimchi his father's facility had been producing with a subculture drawn from Ora's Crock under a separate licensing arrangement he had negotiated with the Artisan Food Company for a secondary use. He left the case on the porch and did not stay long. He said the kimchi was the best thing his father's facility had ever produced, and that the old man had asked him to tell Ora that. The ledger is still on the shelf above the door. It has Delia's 40 pages and Ora's 30 years, and now, in Bess's careful hand, the first entries of a 3rd generation. The Burns Crock still holds the culture, that Delia maintained in Wilkes County before Ora was born. Plum died in the winter of 2024, and there is a new dog now, a young blue tick named Cress, who has already learned that the root cellar door means a good smell, and that Ora's boots mean it is time to walk. There are two kinds of knowing that govern how we value a thing. The first kind measures what can be standardized, replicated, tested in a controlled trial, and written into a guidance document. It is the kind that produces consistent products at scale and protects consumers and gives the people who make it a defensible position when something goes wrong. It is not wrong. It is necessary. It simply cannot see everything. The second kind is what Delia recorded in a pocket ledger in 1952 when she noted that the crock knew the brine, meaning that the vessel and the culture and the cellar and the water and the seasonal pattern of that one piece of ground had arrived over years, at a working relationship that no standardized process could replicate because the relationship was the product. This kind of knowing is invisible to every evaluation designed to measure only what can be isolated, controlled, and standardized. It cannot be certified. It can only be inherited, and then maintained, and then passed on. The crocks that went through a Saturday estate sale in Burke County for $400 that a young fermenter recognized and paid $1,200 for, that led eventually to a research paper and a licensing offer and a graduate student standing in a root cellar with sampling equipment, were not valuable because they were old. They were valuable because someone had understood across 3 generations what they were carrying. The crock does not know the brine, but the people who kept the crock knew what the crock knew and wrote it down and stayed. What survives is not what is most efficient. What survives is what is most attentive to the place it belongs.